You're sitting in a room right now. Maybe not physically, but mentally, you're replaying a conversation that happened earlier. A meeting, a dinner table, a group chat where 5 people were talking over each other, debating, laughing, competing for the air to breathe. And you were there. You listened. While everyone else was performing, you were seeing. You noticed the exact moment someone lied. Not a big lie, a small one, the kind that slides through because it's wrapped in confidence. You watched the hierarchy reorganize itself in real time. You saw who looked at whom before speaking, which meant they needed permission, which meant they already knew they were lower on the ladder. You saw all of it, and nobody knows you saw it. That's what we're talking about today. There's something happening inside you that the world can't see. Your brain doesn't work the way you've been told it works. You've grown up in a culture that measures intelligence by volume, by how fast you think on your feet, by your ability to fill silence with sound, by your performance. But your brain is processing at a different frequency entirely. When you walk into a room, something shifts. Your nervous system doesn't go into performance mode, it goes into reconnaissance mode. It's not anxiety, though people will later tell you that's what it is. It's not shyness, though that word will follow you around like a name you never chose. What it actually is, your brain is working. It's scanning. It's collecting data on every micro-expression in the room, the slight tightness around someone's eyes that suggests they don't believe what they just said, the way someone's shoulders dropped when they thought no one was looking, which means they're tired of performing. The person who laughs too quickly, the one whose hand trembles slightly when they reach for water, the one whose eyes are always moving to the person with the most power in the room. Your mind is doing something that looks like nothing. While everyone else is competing for airtime, you're building a map, a psychological blueprint of the room. You're predicting what each person actually thinks, separate from what they're saying. You're tracking the undercurrents. You're noticing that the person making the loudest argument is the one who's most afraid of being wrong. You're seeing that the person who keeps interrupting does it because silence terrifies them. It means they might have to hear their own thoughts. And here's what makes this invisible. Nobody can see you working. So the room labels you. Quiet, shy, withdrawn, doesn't contribute, not a team player. You know this isn't true. You're not quiet because you have nothing to say. You're quiet because your mind is full. You're not withdrawn because you're afraid of people. You're withdrawn because you're busy processing what everyone else is too loud to notice. But the world doesn't have a category for this, so you begin to internalize their diagnosis. You start to wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe your observations don't matter. Maybe the fact that nobody sees your work means the work isn't real. Maybe intelligence only counts when it's loud enough to be heard. This is where the first crack forms. You begin to doubt the very thing that's strongest in you, your ability to see. You begin to apologize internally for being the way you are. You start to believe that something is wrong with you, when in fact, something is different about you. Your nervous system is wired for depth, not speed, for understanding, not performance, for truth, not approval, and you've been taught your entire life that this is a flaw. Years pass, and a pattern emerges that you can't ignore anymore. People consistently underestimate you in real time. Someone makes a decision in a meeting, and you already saw the flaw 2 minutes before they spoke, but you didn't say anything. Now they're committed to it. Now they're defending it. Now they can't back down without losing face. You could have prevented this. A conversation unfolds where someone is being misled by another person, and you see it happening. You see the manipulation, the subtle distortion of truth, the way the other person is smiling while they lie, and you say nothing. Because speaking up would mean interrupting the social ease. It would mean making the group uncomfortable. It would mean being the one who breaks the peace. Later, you realize the person who was being misled discovered the truth on their own. They were hurt, and you knew beforehand. This creates something deeper than frustration. It creates a quiet resentment. Not the kind that explodes, the kind that builds in silence.
Because every time this happens, you're learning the same lesson. Your voice doesn't have enough weight to stop something, so why bother using it? In professional settings, you watch people with half your understanding climb the ladder because they're louder, because they've learned to climb space, because they've mastered the art of sounding confident. Even when they're thinking on their feet, you think before you speak, which means you speak less. And speaking less means fewer opportunities to be visible, fewer chances to be known. fewer invitations to the meetings where decisions are actually made. In social hierarchies, you notice that the person everyone respects most isn't the one who understands the deepest truths. It's the one who can tell a story with the most conviction. It's the one who doesn't hesitate. It's the one who creates the narrative rather than understanding it. The quiet observer understands the narrative, but understanding isn't currency in a world that trades in performance. In intimate relationships, your silence gets misread constantly. Your partner asks if something's wrong, and you say no, but the silence is actually you thinking. You're processing something you observed. You're deciding whether to speak about it. You're weighing whether the truth is worth the discomfort it will create, and your silence gets interpreted as agreement, or distance, or coldness. What it actually is, consideration, care even, because you're thinking about how to say something in a way that won't wound, but that nuance gets lost in the noise. In family dynamics, you learned early that the quiet child's observations don't count. You saw something unfair happening and you pointed it out calmly, logically, with evidence. Your louder sibling just yelled the same thing without any basis, and somehow their version landed. Somehow their voice carried more weight. So you stopped expecting your voice to carry weight. You learned that silence was safer, that observation was enough, that you could understand the world without needing the world to understand you. The invisible enemy isn't the quiet observer's nature. It's a cultural bias against depth in favor of volume. But you don't see it as systemic. You internalize it as personal failure. You begin to believe that if you were truly intelligent, truly valuable, truly worthy, you would find a way to take up more space. You would be louder. You would be more confident. You would perform better. And so the underestimation doesn't come from the world alone. It comes from you looking in the mirror and seeing what everyone else sees, a quiet person, and believing that's the full story. There are moments you don't talk about. Moments where you knew something was about to go wrong and you said nothing. You're sitting in a room where a decision is being made that you can already see will fail. You understand the flaw in the logic before anyone else does. Your mind has already run the scenario forward and calculated the outcome. But speaking up would mean interrupting. It would mean being the one who questions. It would mean risking being wrong, or worse, being right but not being listened to. So you stay quiet, and the decision gets made. And months later, it fails exactly the way you predicted. There's no satisfaction in being right. There's only the weight of knowing you could have said something. The quiet ache of, I was here, I understood, and I chose not to speak. Someone you care about is being manipulated by another person, and you see it clearly. You see the pattern, you understand the game being played, you know it will end in harm. But pointing it out would mean creating conflict. It would mean being the person who speaks an uncomfortable truth. It would mean potentially damaging your own relationship because the person being manipulated might not believe you. They might think you're jealous or critical or unsupportive. So you stay quiet, and the harm happens, and you carry the weight of your silence. In professional settings, you watch decisions being made in real time that you know are inefficient, that will waste time, that will create problems downstream. You could streamline it. You could offer a better path. You understand the system well enough to improve it. But speaking up means putting yourself forward. It means claiming expertise. It means risking visibility. So you do the work around the bad decision, and you fix the problems after they appear. Quietly, without credit, without recognition. Years accumulate like this. Years of moments where you could have. And each one deposits a small sediment of regret. Not loud regret. Not the kind that drives you to action. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers to you in the morning, you knew better, and you said nothing. Over time, this creates something inside you that feels like acceptance, like you've made peace with your role as the observer who doesn't participate, the person who understands but doesn't contribute, the one who sees but stays invisible. But here's where the psychological truth becomes unavoidable. You begin to realize that some of your silence isn't a personality trait, it's a choice.
A choice rooted in fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of conflict, fear of not being able to explain yourself well enough, fear of being seen as arrogant or pushy, fear that your words, once released, won't land the way you intended them. And that realization is when everything begins to shift. Because if it's a choice, then you have agency, which means you've been choosing silence over impact. You've been choosing invisibility over influence. You've been choosing safety over truth.
not because you had to, but because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't. And then something happens that changes the way you understand yourself entirely. You stop looking at your quietness as a flaw, and you start looking at the loudness around you as a symptom. You begin to notice something that psychology has documented for decades, but that nobody explicitly tells you. The people who speak the most are often the most insecure about being forgotten. Think about the person in your life who dominates conversations, who always has a story, who can't sit in silence without filling it with words, who needs to be heard constantly. What are they actually afraid of? They're afraid that if they stop talking, they'll disappear. Their entire sense of existence is built on being heard, being acknowledged, being the center of attention. The moment they stop performing, they stop existing in their own mind. So they speak constantly, they interrupt, they dominate, they can't let silence happen because silence is death to them. And you've been measuring yourself against this. You've been thinking that if you're not like this, you're deficient. You've been believing that confidence means being loud, that intelligence means being quick, that value means being visible. But now you're beginning to see something else. The people who speak the least in a room are often the ones with the least need for external validation. They don't need to be heard to know they exist. They don't need to be seen to know they have value. They understand themselves internally. Their sense of self is built on what they know, not on what others think they know. And that's an entirely different kind of confidence. It's the confidence of the person who doesn't need to prove anything. You start to notice a pattern in yourself that contradicts everything you've been told. You rarely regret what you didn't say. Think about that. Most people's biggest regrets are around words they didn't say. I wish I had told them I loved them. I wish I had asked for the promotion. I wish I had said no. But your regrets are different. Your regrets are about times you did speak without full understanding, times you reacted instead of thinking, times you said something because you felt obligated to contribute and it came out wrong, and you've been thinking about it ever since. Your silence has protected you. While other people are still processing through trial and error in public, making mistakes in real time, you've already processed internally. You've already made the mistakes in your mind. You've already figured out what works. So when you finally speak, it lands differently. Not louder, but weighted. There's clarity in it, earned from genuine thought, not reflexive reaction. And this is where the awakening deepens into something even more profound. Your quietness isn't weakness, it's efficiency. It's not fear, it's discernment. It's not that you have nothing to say, it's that you have standards for what's worth saying. And that is actually the definition of discipline. This is where everything changes, but not in the way you've been taught to expect. Nobody's going to tell you to suddenly become louder. Nobody's going to motivate you to take up more space. That's not what this is about. What's actually happening is something deeper. You're recalibrating how you understand discipline itself. For your entire life, you've thought of discipline as forcing yourself to do something that doesn't come naturally. Discipline in the cultural narrative means struggling against your nature. It means the introvert forcing themselves to be extroverted. It means the quiet person learning to speak more. It means fighting against who you are. But that's not discipline. That's self-abandonment. True discipline looks different for you. Your discipline isn't about speaking more. It's about being discerning about when to speak. It's about setting a high standard for what comes out of your mouth. It's about refusing to say something just because the social moment demands it. That's discipline rooted in self-respect. When you finally speak in a room, You're not speaking because you need to be heard. You're speaking because you have something to contribute. You're not speaking to fill space. You're speaking because you've thought about it deeply and you've decided this truth needs to be said. Do you understand what that does? When a quiet observer speaks with that intention, the entire room shifts. People listen, not because you're loud, because there's weight behind it, because you're not performing, because they can feel that you've thought about it. Your presence changes. You're no longer the person everyone talks around. You're becoming the person people actually listen to. Not because you're louder, but because you're more intentional. The identity shift happens at this point. You stop seeing yourself as the quiet person. You start seeing yourself as the observer who speaks with purpose. And this is freedom. Not the freedom to speak more, the freedom to stop apologizing for speaking less. You stop feeling the need to jump into conversations just to prove you're engaged. You stop forcing laughter to seem connected. You stop filling silence to seem comfortable. You become someone who is comfortable in their own silence, and that becomes magnetic. People are starving for this. In a world of constant noise, constant performance, constant need to be heard, the person who doesn't need to be heard stands out. The person who is quiet by choice, not by fear. The person who speaks when it matters. This is a completely different energy, and you've been building this power the entire time without even realizing it. Let's be clear about what you've actually developed. Over years of observation, you've built something that psychology recognizes as one of the most valuable forms of intelligence, the ability to read human beings. You understand social dynamics in a way that most people never will. You can walk into a room and know instantly who has power, who's performing power, who's lost power, and who's gaining it. You understand the underlying currents while everyone else is still watching the surface. You understand people's motivations better than they do. You can see when someone is acting out of insecurity versus confidence. You can predict how someone will react to bad news before they hear it. You understand what people actually want, separate from what they say they want. You're harder to manipulate because you've already seen through the narrative. Someone can tell you a story, and you're already thinking about what they're not saying. You're already considering their hidden agenda. You're already aware of what they're gaining by influencing your perception. This is a form of power that the world doesn't talk about, but it's real. In leadership, the ability to understand people without needing to dominate them is becoming increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The best leaders aren't the loudest. They're the ones who understand their team deeply enough to know what each person needs, what drives them, what brings out their best work. You have this, natural. In relationships, the ability to truly see another person, not judge them, but understand them, is the difference between a surface connection and genuine intimacy. You have this. In decision-making, the ability to consider all angles before moving forward is what prevents catastrophic mistakes. Most people charge forward and adjust on the fly. You think through consequences internally. You see patterns others miss. In life, the people who change the world aren't always the loudest. They're often the ones who've watched long enough to understand what actually needs to change. You've been developing this power the entire time, thinking it was weakness. You've been building a sophisticated understanding of human psychology while believing you had nothing to contribute. You've been gathering intelligence that most people will never possess. And you've been calling yourself quiet, when what you actually are is aware. Now that you understand this about yourself, everything changes, but not in the way you might think, because understanding that your nature isn't a flaw doesn't automatically resolve the question of what you do with it. You see differently now. You understand people more deeply. You have observations that matter. You have insights worth sharing. But you still have a choice to make. And this is where it gets real. Will you remain invisible? Will
You stay in the observer role, knowing what you know, seeing what you see, and deciding that safety is more important than impact? Or will you begin to step into visibility, not loudly, not performatively, but purposefully? Will you use what you've learned about human nature to actually shape the conversations instead of just watching them? Will you finally offer the insights that could change someone's direction, even if it means briefly being uncomfortable? The fear hasn't gone away. Understanding yourself better doesn't erase the vulnerability of being seen. It doesn't make it easy to speak when you've spent years practicing silence. But now you know something different. You know that your silence is a choice, not a fate. And that means the opposite is also true. Your voice, when you choose to use it, is a choice as well. And here's the deepest question, the one I'll leave with you. How much of your silence is actually wisdom, and how much of it is fear wearing the mask of wisdom? Because there's a difference. The wise observer speaks when it matters. The fearful observer hides behind the appearance of wisdom. The wise observer uses their awareness as a tool. The fearful observer uses it as a shield. And only you can tell which one you've been. Only you know whether your quietness is because you've genuinely decided that some moments don't deserve your voice, or whether it's because you've been afraid that when you finally do speak, you won't be heard the way you intended. That's the question that sits with you now. Not answered, not resolved, but present. And I think you know which one it is. Before you close this, if this resonated with you, if you felt seen in what I just described, then you understand something that most people still don't. You understand that psychology isn't just diagnosis, it's recognition. It's someone articulating what you've been living but couldn't name. If you want more of this, more insights that speak directly to the psychology of who you actually are, more language for the things you've been experiencing silently, then subscribe to this channel. Because what we're doing here is different. We're not motivating you to change who you are. We're helping you understand who you've been all along. And that changes everything. Subscribe.